Boundless Immigration News. Weekend Review, October 14th, 2022. Federal judge allows DACA to continue, for now. A federal judge ruled Friday that the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA program can continue temporarily after a federal appeals court ruled the policy unlawful. U.S. District Judge Andrew Hannon said the program would be allowed to continue for now, but new applicants would still be barred from applying. Hannon asked attorneys in the case to submit more information, but he set no date for future hearings. Voters say Republicans would do a better job on immigration. With just 3 weeks to go until the midterm elections, recent polls show voters favor Republicans over Democrats to solve the country's immigration issues. According to a Reuters poll, 40% of registered voters say Republicans are better able to tackle immigration issues than Democrats. Among respondents, non-Hispanic whites without college degree and white women living in suburban areas preferred Republicans' stance on immigration, while people with college degrees skewed Democrat. Undocumented immigrants head to Florida to help with hurricane cleanup. A growing number of undocumented immigrants are heading to Florida to help clean up after Hurricane Ian devastated cities along the coast. At the same time, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has actively discouraged migrant workers from coming to the state. Migrant workers, many of whom are undocumented, play a critical role in disaster recovery across the U.S. cities like New Orleans and Houston. They depended on immigrant workers to rebuild their storm-ravaged communities. Biden administration offers legal status to thousands of Venezuelans. The Biden administration announced Wednesday it would allow up to 24,000 Venezuelans to enter the U.S. by air under a humanitarian parole program. Venezuelans who enter the country illegally, however, will be sent straight to Mexico under a controversial Trump-era public health rule known as Title 42. The announcement comes after a dramatic surge of Venezuelan migrants to the U.S.-Mexico border. So far this year, more than 100,000 Venezuelans have made the dangerous trek through the jungle to Panama in hopes of reaching the U.S. southern border. That's it for this weekend's immigration news. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Boundless. Thanks for watching.